Hi, everyone. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Just a heads up, I'm doing front and back end, so I'm realizing I'm not going to be able to read my notes while the screen shares up. So I'm going to close this, but for everybody who has logged in, I welcome you. So hello, everyone. Welcome to Behold Artist Talk. My name is Daonne Huff, and I'll be moderating today's conversation with all 5 of the exhibition's artists: Oasa DuVerney, Sana Musasama, Komikka Patton, Roberto Visani, and Chris Watts. On behalf of Ivy Jones, who wears 2 hats as exhibition curator, as well as being the owner of Welancora, I'd like to thank you so much for joining us this afternoon from wherever you may be tuning in from. So just a little warm up or setting the tone. This program is happening a week after the start of the Gregorian calendar's new year. And so often we are encouraged to make resolutions, repairs, and resets of behaviors, choices, and patterns, to choose to change the way we always do things, to see things. And the intention of this show was to examine alternative ways of interrogating notions of Blackness. So at the start of 2022, as a means of changing perceptions, here is an offering of opportunities to observe more deeply from a different vantage point. Given all that we have witnessed in the last 2, 5, 50, 100, 400 years, I ask you all to consider, when I say Black, what do you feel? What do you see? What do you show? And I'll just let that simmer. So to get us started, I'll be sharing slides of the exhibition's artworks, and I'll ask each artist a question, and then we'll open things up for a group conversation. If any of you in the audience have questions, please put them in the Q&A box, and I'll aim to get to a few at the end. And to learn more about all the artists, please visit the exhibitions page on Welancora's website. So I'm going to share my screen now. One second. Okay, artists, can you see the screen? Yes, great, okay. Okay, so we're gonna start. Can you still see my screen?
Yes.
Yes, okay. So we're gonna start with Oasa. My questions. Okay. Can you see my questions on the screen? Sorry. No, okay, you can just see the image. Okay, just wanna make sure. So my question to Oasa: the wave is a recurring motif in your practice that you've rendered on varying scales and surfaces. Can you speak to your relationship to waves? And then just expanding on that, would you see it as a stand-in, a surrogate, a metaphor, a reference to something? And then more broadly, could you speak to your use of natural world elements that evoke a sense of scale, power, reverence, and dominance?
Wow, that's that's a lot to think about. And I think when I first started drawing these Black Power waves, it was part of this, it was part of like a bigger or longer investigation and questioning that I had going on just in like in my life and in my professional artist practice. And that was, I guess it was based on a lot of like conversations I was having throughout the years of why I'm doing what I'm doing and how it was being received, how people were responding to it. And I felt like a lot of the times my artwork or I was being responded to with, there's like a lot of expectations about what my work should be and what I should be like And it all had to do with these preconceived notions of what Black women are and what Black art is. And I think for a while I was kind of making fun of that. And you see that in my earlier work with the illustrated guide to not being so fucking racist. Or like this series of portraits of white men that I was drawing. And it was fun and it was funny, but I still was very much so interested. Well, how do I express my feelings? Like, what is it? How does it feel? Or how do I make that universal without the exploitation of our Black bodies? And so I turned to different elements in nature. My family is from the Caribbean, and in the Caribbean, we admit to all of ancestry. It's not hidden or exoticized in the same way that it is in the U.S. It's like I'm Black, but I'm also Chinese and I'm also Indigenous, and people can understand that. And it's not. I don't know. It's not a thing the way it's a thing here. It's not impossible. People can't wrap their minds around. In other parts of the world, people can't wrap their minds around like those things. But where my family is from, Trinidad, you can't mind around that. And it is very common. And so it's also very common, the mixture of these different aesthetics. And I feel like a lot of my aesthetic approaches probably comes from looking at a lot of classical Chinese painting growing up, just because there was a lot of that in my house. And so it kind of looking to that, that kind of, or that time in art and that way of making art, I think was like a way of me trying to find solidarity. And through approach and through aesthetics, and then also through symbolism. I think it was like, I think the first one I tried of like, well, how do I convey this feeling of like Black power and pride in myself without that exploitation? I think I had like tried storm clouds and snakes and the water, like flowers and some other things. But the water just seemed metaphorically the most powerful and the most universal because we desire it so much, and we rely on it so much, and it'll also kill you. And that's like a really, that's like a very real experience for a lot of people, all of us. It's funny because when I read the email with your question, for some reason I thought about this thing I had not thought about before, and that was drowning when I was a child in the pool of a strange white woman that I didn't know, that I was with a cousin who passes for white and lived in a white world, and this lady invited us to swim in her pool, and I almost and so I don't know, there's a lot of relationships with water, and I think that's just like one of the things that attracted me to using it. Also thinking about the transatlantic slave trade, that journey through that water, and what it was, what it is, and what can we make it now, and in the future, kind of thinking about those things. I'm rambling now, so I'm going to stop.
No, it's like I want to go on these other tangents, but I'm also mindful that we have such an incredible roster of people, so we're going to keep it moving, but let's put a pin in that. And so just as I'm scrolling through the presentation, you'll also, the audience will also be able to see the second work that Oasa contributed, A Stoic Mounting of White Guilt. And so next, Komikka, my question to you is, could you speak to the multi-sensory experience of your drawing? There is a leaning into the role of touch, sound, and movement in both the title, Mother Used to Scream, and when I heard her, chills came on my skin, and the forms depicted. And altogether, it's evoking expression, emotion, and feeling without relying on what many would consider the most expressive part of the body, the face. So what compelled you to protect or shield the subject in that manner, but then also speaking to those earlier observations too?
Yeah, so this piece was completed in 2018, and I had just got back from South Africa. And a lot of my work was centered around this archetype of the mother, from micro, such as biological, and macro, such as Mother Universe, Mother God, et cetera, this divine feminine essence. And so as I'm diving into this mother archetype, I was questioning mothers within myself, outside mothers such as aunties and neighbors, mothers of like divinity mothers such as Kali and et cetera, Yemoya and et cetera. So I was really kind of consumed with mother. And at the time I was also reading Fred Moten in the break, and I recommend that book for all of you. It's such if you haven't read it, it's an amazing, amazing book. And I love the fact that he was able to use film terminology such as rewind and fast forward, and kind of breaking down this aspect of time in a way that I was able to understand and start to insert into my drawing practice. And so I was interested in how can I draw the past, present, and future simultaneously? How can I draw a sequence, definitely comic book inspired and ink drawing inspired and film inspired? I wanted to show cycles. And so with this piece intentionally, I wanted to not necessarily hide the face, but use a different form of expression, such as our second most active part of the body, our hands. And can I tell a story with just hands? Can I tell a sequence of what has happened and what will happen with just hands? And I'm really interested in stepping into the unknown, right? A lot of my work is in these futuristic spaces of how do we insert ourselves into the unknown. And I wanted this piece to be a revisit of vulnerability. I think the pieces that I'm seeing quite often in gallery spaces at the moment, particularly with African-American, or excuse me, Black work, is yes, celebration and power and invoking, you know, so much strength. But I really wanted to show what does it look like to walk into the unknown uncertain? What does it look like to walk into the unknown afraid, or maybe throwing a tantrum? So I wanted to tell that story with hands.
Thank you.
Did I answer that question?
You definitely did, and then some. And then once again, I'm like, there are other things that I want to say and do, but we're going to come back. We're going to come back. So thank you. And so next we have Sana. My question to you, Sana, I'm going to give the audience context for what you're seeing. So your work, We Were Here, is inspired by the maple tree movement, which I'd never heard of before this, from the 1790s. And for those not familiar, this was an effort by abolitionists for the US produced maple syrup gathered in more humane manners to become the sweetener of preference, rather than the Caribbean-based sugarcane, which was fueled by slave labor. So Sana, I'm interested in hearing about the connection between the laying of hands, connecting back to the hands, Komikka, in the formation of your clay-based sculptural installation, and the laying of hands in agriculture, and who is most inclined to embark on that work. And then that second part is, and to take it one step further, the connection to labor, and whose labor is often responsible for that, and the value of that work that's oftentimes invisible or undervalued.
Well, the hands and the sculptures in this maple tree, as well as the entire series, and most of my work has multiple meanings, some personal and some from travel experiences. But the ones that are personal that I'd like to share is that my mother went blind in my late teens, and when she went blind, of course, she became brokenhearted, and for the remainder of her life, which was only 5 years, she decided not to talk and to only use her hands to communicate with. She was trying to learn Braille, she was trying to learn sign language, but at that age, which was probably 17 for me, I began to only look at her hands for the remainder of her life. So hands are monumentally important because of that personal reason. Another is I spend a lot of time in Cambodia working at an anti-trafficking, sex trafficking organization. I go to the killing fields with my Cambodian family and walking around on remains of what was once humans, pelvics, skulls, parts of the thighs. All of these are echoes and memories of me. So in the trees, the hand form is really the root to the tree that is refusing to go down into the earth for water, but instead thrusting up through the earth with fingers on the end of it saying that I exist, just showing that in genocides and holocausts around the world, it's the human hand or the body parts that are more valued than the human being, than the heart, than the mind. Mm. If one has disabilities with seeing like my mother, or walking like my uncle, or the loss of their hands like I lost the loss of my hands for a year, you would be exterminated. So the hands are there for that. And being a world traveler and being a woman, I extend my hand to help, to assist, to understand, to learn, to grow. So the hands is a form of speech, language, and silence all in one. Mm. And in most of the countries or places that I've traveled in, the hand is used as free labor. Most of the time, just women, children, and predominantly those children are little girls. Mm.
Thank you. So now I'm going to move to Roberto, and there are two works in this show that connect. So I'm just going to kind of give the audience a view of both, since the question that I'll be asking will, I'm going to focus on this one. So Roberto, the two works featured in the show were in part inspired by Hiram Power's 1843 sculpture, The Greek Slave, which for those who aren't familiar with this piece, he actually patented it in order to protect illegal reproductions. And that's making me think of possession and ownership. To own a work of art, to own a body, and both of which are treated and viewed as objects to possess. And additionally, thinking about use of the line work to construct the forms compels me to think of a duality between construction and destruction. The mapping, gridding of a form, but also in that I see a shooting range target. So I'm interested if you could speak to any of those observations as it relates to your work, or maybe I'm, totally off. Oh wait, you're muted, Roberto.
Yeah, thanks. The image that's on the screen now is based on this Wedgwood medallion from 1787 of a kneeling slave or enslaved person, and then the one above the female figure is based on Hiram Power's Greek slave. And so it's part of a larger project called the Cardboard Slave Kit, where I'm sort of making these sculptural kits based on art historical imagery of enslaved people. The drawings kind of come out of that because the sculptures are first digitized before they're physically built. So as I'm working on the digital file, sometimes I'll turn the model and I'll see a particular kind of view that starts to suggest another narrative, starts to define the figure in a new way. So in this case, both of them, you're kind of looking at them from the back. So it's almost like you have the same vantage point that they do. Rather than being looked at, you're looking with, which I think is powerful. There is this idea of construction. I wouldn't say destruction, but this notion that you could put this thing together and take it apart. It's a package, it's a product that can be bought and sold. So yeah, I agree with your reading of that. And one thing that's really motivating this is like this question that our culture has had to deal with since Africans were brought here, is like what to do with these bodies. What to do with the Black body. After enslaved people were used for their labor, and then that sort of institution was slowly taken apart, this problem still exists to this day, and so slave is such a charged word. And as I encounter these kind of historical images, it's almost like they start to calcify within, a museum or a history book or something like that. There's no new reading to it. But sometimes I think about it like the way that I experienced the 80s and 90s and hearing about, police violence from friends, and then the way it's sort of talked about now, and thinking about slavery in that same kind of way. Like my understanding of slavery is completely different than people that were enslaved in 17th to 18th century. Yet I have some of that experience within me that's passed on and that's sort of taught and imposed upon me. And so sometimes when I hear about, there might be a video on the news and there's this outrage. Well, those same things were happening before there was video, but the experience of those things was different. And so the way that the media, or, artwork being one of them, kind of communicates these ideas from one generation to the other really shifts our understanding of them. So I thought it made sense to sort of work with these images in a kind of digital format, in the language of today, but then also have some kind of comparison to the past. So.
Great, thank you. And I think that's a really wonderful way of setting up for our last individual artist question to Chris. And Chris has a few works in the show, so I'll just quickly let the audience see those before I ask my question. I'm going to scroll back to So Chris, with much of your practice, you're examining surveillance, body cams, and police brutality. But I think for our audience in your paintings, we're not seeing bodies. So would you consider your usage of abstraction and paying homage to Elijah McClain, an unarmed Black man killed by police in Colorado in 2019, as an act of protest for, as well as an act of protection against the commodification and objectification of the Black body in popular culture media?
Well, generally speaking, I mean, I think being an artist is an act of protest. So yes, most certainly. My belief in abstraction as sort of a gateway or portal to a more expansive approach in investigating, memorializing, recording, celebrating, and oftentimes paying homage to Blackness was first welcomed to me by my own history of reproducing images of the figure. And so, I guess further investigating these ideas of like surveillance and what's being captured, we all have a different way of protesting, and mine was even protesting against my own history of creating images that depicted the Black body. The Black on Black on Black series, which I first created in 2017, were created with works. I mean, they're only works that memorialize instances of violence and brutality towards Black bodies, and these instances often led to fatality. And so, thinking about memorials and ways to deal with kind of the pain and the suffering that Black communities kind of often are burdened with these incidences, became kind of a really strong interest for me. Like, what are the terms of the visible whenever these body cams that are capturing these kind of moments, and when they go to court of law, like, what are the conversations had in the courtroom? You know, when an image is kind of all telling, especially in photography, in the history of photography or the history of film, and the image is absolute. But when high court, they say, well, these incidents did not happen this way. And then it's difficult for one who is interested in these visual depictions, who studies these depictions, to put a lot of trust into of depicting the Black body. And so I feel like abstraction is a natural entry point of examining all the things that are unseen. The Black on Black series are all on Black walls, and a lot of that just comes from my interest in kind of invert color symbolism and also illuminating Blackness. Most gallery walls are on white walls, and how can we put an importance on Blackness, not in a metaphorical term, but in a literal way. I know it's seemingly kind of a subversive term, but even kind of racialized symbolism are, turning our attention to transparency or absence or disappearance, or the non-locatable kind of subject within these images.
Thank you. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen now. So hopefully everybody in the room has memories of what they have witnessed. So we'll be referencing those as we continue to the group part. So for my first group question, I'm going to kind of set the stage by, with all of the works that are in the show, there are these really wonderful overlaps that are appearing in terms of the content, in terms of the approach to representing the body or not representing the body, but then also underlyingly with all of it, like these intentional messaging or messages that are happening about relationships and memory. So I'd like to share a passage from Christina Sharpe's In the Wake on Blackness and Being, that in reading it, I thought of everyone's work in some capacity and how each work is speaking to each other. So after I read this, I would love for anybody who has a reaction to it, and if you want to speak more expansively about how it relates to your work. So wakes are processes. Through them, we think about the dead and about our relations to them. They are rituals through which to enact grief and memory. Wakes allow those among the living to mourn the tasing of the dead through ritual. They are the watching of relatives and friends beside the body of the deceased, from death to burial, and the accompanying drinking, feasting, and other observances. A watching practice as a religious observance. The wakes are also the track left on the water surface by a ship, the disturbance caused by a body swimming, or one that is moved in the water. The air currents behind a body in flight, a region of disturbed flow, in the line of sight of an observed object, and something in the line of recoil of a gun. Finally, wake means being awake and also consciousness.
Hi, I just wanted to say I love that. Thank you so much for sending that. I thought that was so special. And when I was reading that, the one thing that I did think of was awake is also, and of course, it's pretty obvious, a celebration of a life lived. And in relation to my work, I think that I am really interested in showing the totality of a life lived, from birth till death, and the beauty of life, no matter how traumatic or painful or complex that existence may be, it is still a very beautiful existence. And so when that quote particularly said, the air current behind a body in flight, I smiled because of, yes, we are constantly in flight with maybe various directions of where we're going, but the wake being, I guess, a moment after death is still in motion. So, which is why I think I'm really interested in showing movement as well as time.
Thank you. Chris?
No, I thought it was also a really beautiful excerpt. That's a text that I'm not familiar with, but as soon as I kind of finished that, I kind of dove into what I could find of it existed on an internet. And you know, I think ritual and mourning kind of really spoke to the work that's being exhibited right now in the space in just kind of a more eloquent way. Yeah, no, I just thought it was a really beautiful passage.
We'll keep it moving. Or did anyone else want to respond? Sana, did you want to? Yeah.
Yeah, the words that came up for me when I also thought it was a very beautiful response of Christina's writing I love is words that came up for me when I applied to my work were things like echoes, uncovering, scratching back, shards of truth and discovery. And I think that were some of the main passions that informed me when I began making the Maple Trees series. It was uncovering a story that somebody decided wasn't important enough to be in our history books. So none of us ever learned about it in the classrooms. And I happened to find out about it quite by accident and decided that I would spend 10 years bringing that story back to us, to who it belonged to. So uncovering, being awake, scratching back for me.
Lisa?
Yeah, I think I guess maybe it was like a couple of weeks ago. And I visited, I believe, Fort Tilden Beach, and there were, I don't know what they're called, those beams in the water. And the tide was hitting them, and they are really eroded and growing a lot of moss, and lots of shells were in there. And just watching the water wakes kind of maneuver through them, in between them, is kind of I don't know, for me, it was an interesting idea in the sense of like, here's this vast ocean that's faced, and essentially this wood is unmovable in a sense, but that constant beating of it from the sea has, you know, worn it down almost completely in a lot of different places. So I don't know, reading that passage, it made me think about like one, persistence, and maybe like what Komikka was saying of time, and here we kind of wear each other out in one way and the other, in both directions. And again, I'll stop because I feel like I'm rambling.
No, you're not. You're not. It's free flowing. It's fluid, like a wave, ebbs and flows. Yeah.
I wanted to say something related to what Komikka said about this idea of movement, which I think is really appropriate. But at the same time, she's also talking about wake as marking a specific event, you know, with the passing of somebody. And I mean, one beautiful thing about that passage that I think as artists we're all sensitive to is that to not look at the subject as monolithic, it's polylythic. And so how do we frame things in a way that have multiple readings that sort of intertwine and relate to one another? We all understand that there's certain markers in life, but we all understand that there's a continuity from one generation to the other, and how everything comes from somewhere, but things are new, but they're not exactly repeated. So those like little nuances behind the language, I think, are really an apt way to think about the exhibition and our practices.
Absolutely. Thank you. And so connecting to that, I think the weight of that passage kind of sticks and lingers with me, and it's making me think about the usage of beauty and creating beautiful objects as an alternative approach to depicting the pain and trauma and systemic injustices of us, of our people, and is that our means of coping and processing and healing by creating a visual rewrite of our histories.
It's almost kind of like to remember what survives beyond these violent events, right? Almost kind of like a wave, it crashes and then it's calm again, and then it's kind of reactivated, which can also be very beautiful. I feel like over the long run of human history, the constant presence of beauty helps us, calls us to the work of repairing injury in the realm of injustice, which is, I love this statement. Elaine Scarry said that, and it kind of really stuck with me in a way to use beauty as a weapon and also kind of as a tool. That the abstraction that I'm personally interested in is not of depiction, but it's also not formulaic. Kind of interested in like the emancipatory like quality of the aesthetic experience. Kind of like the way of the orator to tell a story, to make sure it's remembered. And yes, I guess it can operate it like as an aesthetic force that is capable of speaking directly to the soul, which hopefully speaks to many people and not just our people.
I love that, Chris. Thank you so much for that quote. Yes, using beauty as a weapon and a tool. And when you said that, I instantly wrote down in a trap, almost like the Venus flytrap. Like, come look at this beautiful thing, and then here's what I'm really talking about. And I think that's how I use quote unquote beauty, right? When I initially saw that question, I wrote down, I don't use beauty as a coping mechanism to cope with pain and tragedy. I think that my drawing or just drawing beautiful objects or being interested in beautiful composition or whatever, how you're using beauty, is just that I see life as beautiful, and the tools that I use to draw or depict beauty just so happen to be through a pen, just so happen to be through ink, just so happen to be done in this way that just ends up being beautiful. But it's not a coping mechanism. It's not trying to cover up. It's not trying to hide. It's not trying to rewrite. It's literally just like, this is what it is.
I wanted to, the thing that kind of stuck out in your question for me was trauma. And I think it's probably because it's something that the imagery that I'm working with is so engaged in this notion of trauma, collective trauma, epigenetic trauma that's been passed down. I think it's a controversial trauma is controversial. Like, I can think of certain artists, Black artists who've dealt with trauma, and people shut down. They don't really want to engage the work. So, engaging trauma is, I think, at least for me, is an important way of healing and moving forward. Like I have like a little bit of I mean, this is like kind of not related to my work, but I have a little issue with arachnophobia. You know, been afraid of spiders since I was a little boy. And the way I've been able to manage it over time is by seeing images of spiders in friendly spaces. So sort of translating that to my practice and this notion of like dealing with the slave imagery and things like that. I mean, there's some images that I'm thinking about that are like kind of difficult to like deal with. And so how do the question becomes how to depict something like that in a way that's productive and that's healing and that doesn't rub salt into the wound. So like one of them is that the kits themselves are kind of meant to be communal, that they can be built by a group of people, like within a classroom setting or community group or something like that. So maybe the conversations that sharing kind of thing starts to help people come together and understand the imagery in a different way. And then the drawings, they sort of like start to remove our relationship. It becomes less about an object and more personalized in a way, I think, that the relationship I'm trying to form with the images that I'm creating.
And some of the work that I've done, not so much with maple trees, but in other series that have dealt a lot with pain and trauma, my way of making complicated subject matters readable or digestible was my use of playing with other materials and colors and glazes. So I would use things that were lush and fat and juicy and inviting to get my viewer closer to my work, so that then their eyes would then rest on the form, read the titles, and then begin to understand the narrative. Once I was criticized for making pieces about female excision that were beautiful, and the woman who was speaking to me about it was very, very angry about why they were so beautiful. And I had lived on the continent, had lived around the ritual, had been around it, was not promoting the ritual, but I wanted the world to know that there were components of the ritual that were important, life-sustaining, and beautiful too, and that it wasn't what the West only knew of being barbaric and uncivilized and savage and trying to take a woman's power away from her, which ultimately, unfortunately, can be the downside. But by applying beautiful greens and lush yellows and purples, colors that were meaningful to the ritual, was a way of softening or inviting my viewer in. My colors were beautiful, but my forms told more of what was actually happening. They would be ripped and torn and stitched and appliqued, but the colors were beautiful. Had I done the work and responding to this woman the way that she would have done them, no one would have viewed the work. Not as many people would have been exposed to my interpretation of the narrative, nor would have we all learned as much as I think that we did learn. And the work was supported mostly by the medical field. Gynecologists purchased the work to educate. So the color became a decoy, but the skin of the form told the story, but the color invited you in.
Oasa, did you want to say anything, or we'll move on to, did you?
I'm good.
Okay, thank you. So we're at 3:45. So if anyone in the room does have a question for our artist, please put them in the chat and I'll ask. But I have so many questions that I want to ask y'all. So let's go to the role of titles, because I feel like that's something with all of your works too. The titles carry an extra weight, not just they're a means of letting people in and having a means of having a guide. So with works that ask of the viewer to linger a little longer, to find patterns, traces, auras, because what is presented before them isn't so immediately legible, the title of a work takes on greater meaning. And with many of the works in the show, the title is not just a description, it's a statement. It's a scene, a rooting in time or place or feeling. So could you each speak to the role of the title as a means of giving life to the physical works and the intentions behind them?
The bases of all of the trees, the maple trees, are installations of burial sites. And so you see images of hands, body parts, faces, ears, eyes, all of it are just echoes of what once was, that's staying on the surface of the soil. So we were here. That's what all those faces and hands and fragments are saying. We're not gone.
Mm.
I feel like you I feel like you gave a lot for us to chew on, and I know you kind of skipped over this, but in the essay Venus in Two Acts, Hartman imagined, well, she brings she brings this up, and she's like, Hartman imagines Venus and the tragedy as twofold. First her body was ravaged, and then no one remembered her name. And I felt like that I was like hit in the face with that as soon as I kind of came across that, because in memorializing these individuals or remembering these individuals, I feel like their name is very important. And so thinking about titles, in Respect the Boundaries, Throne of Elijah, and I Am Speaking, Kingdom of Elijah, and, his name being echoed in that as you're kind of looking at these very lush, colorful, radiant, almost atmospheric and otherly paintings, it's important. It tells its story. Even, respect the boundaries is Elijah's words that were used in those audio recordings of the police body camps. He's telling them, his victimizers, who he is. And as it's being recorded, he's also letting us know who he is. And thus, he's doing his own archiving in some sense. So we remember who he is.
So that the idea about I'd like to speak about one of the titles of one of the works in the show, the image of the man's back, and the title of the piece is Back. And as when I sort of frame that vantage point, I was thinking about Miles Davis and how during his performances he would, he got to a stage in his career where he turned his back on the audience and he was playing, and the significance of that. Part of it is like being upset with the audience because of the way he was treating him and the way he's being regarded in the press and things like that. But part of it also is about this idea of agency, his individual agency to want to play music despite all the criticism that he was getting, and want to still get up there and perform and know that he has to deal with the scrutiny that he's receiving. And so it's kind of interesting to think about the image of that enslaved man having that same kind of agency and having sort of thoughts beyond this state of being enslaved. So it made sense to talk, to use that title.
And to feed off of the jazz bit, the title of my work, Mother Used to Scream, and when I hear her, chills come upon my skin. It's a short quote from a long written passage that I did for when I was attending NYU, and I was interested at the time, like I mentioned before, Fred Moten. And something that he did in the break was he broke down jazz and he broke down improv, and he use the scream of Black women, particularly mothers, as these almost bridges in time. So how that quote kind of extends, and I don't know it by heart, but it was something along the lines of, I don't know if it's from pain or orgasm. I don't know, and it's strong and then strained and then strong again. And I wanted to get through this idea of, yes, there is beauty in pain, and yes, this pain is a cycle, right? We have, from slavery times, we still have mothers giving birth and screaming, and we have the pain of a mother losing her son via police brutality, and we have the scream of the heightened orgasm, and sometimes these screams can kind of blend and sound almost the same. Mm-hmm. And so I wanted to get through, like I said, I'm still so interested in time, and I think my works are definitely portals to not only this place, but ancient places and also futuristic places, because I want to, I guess, think about the intangible, or think about the what is constant, which is why I became so incredibly enveloped in the idea of mother, because we will always have mothers on the planet. Mothers will always exist. And so I became really interested in the Black femme body and her vulnerability in exploring herself, getting to know herself, mothering herself, being possibly a future mother, getting in tune with African deities who are also known as mothers, getting in tune with Mother Universe, as I mentioned before. What does mother look like? Who does mother look like to you? And so, and what does mother sound like? And so when I think of personal experiences with my own mother, we've all been yelled at for something, you know, as kids and as children. And what is that memory of a scream? And did my mother scream as I was, you know, as she was birthing me? You know, did my mother scream in various moments? What does that sound like? And so I became interested in sound, and how can I put sound in my work? And that's kind of where the title came from.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Oasa?
Yeah, I think for me, titling these works, or more so to provide a framing for them, because they are very symbolic. Not as, I guess there's something also very literal about them. I would say especially the the mountain, the stoic mountain of white guilt. I think it would be easy for people to look at it and just think about kind of like the textural quality, the glow and the luster of fool's gold, and equate it with so many different things. I guess same thing with the waves, but through the titles, I can create this frame that the viewer cannot escape my intention. They can't mistake it for something that it's not.
Thank you. So we have about 5 minutes left of our hour, which went by really quickly. I think we have time for one more question, so I'm going to squeeze one more in. And this is when I was preparing for this talk. I was going for a long walk, which is something I do to clear my head. And so this came to mind as I was thinking about all of you. Void of the gaze, of direct eye contact, we live rich interior worlds. We define ourselves. And I guess for me, it's like, does that resonate with you? And do you see your works as challenges to notions of legibility? So it's like Roberto thinking about the back, where I think a lot of people maybe in having your back to someone, it would be as a sign of disrespect. But really you're reclaiming that notion of actually it's the agency of that individual to kind of hold something, precious. Or to think about with Komikka, what you're saying, that this role of the hands and this gesture it's a different type of communication and expression that still retains something for the individual. I think, Chris, it's also coming into play too in the choice of abstraction as a different play of making something visible. So with all of you, I'm curious if that resonates with the work, or why of the work that you do.
I think within a frame of, white supremacy, that Blackness it's like a performative kind of thing, sort of like watched and looked at and read. And I said it earlier, like in a very monolithic way. So, as artists, I think the first question is that, we sort of don't accept a lot of those stereotypes. And the longer I've been making art, the more and more I've sort of found a voice that is my own, like I which is the goal, is that I sort of started with a lot of influences, and I could read them in my work, and the more and more I've gone along, the less and less I think about those influences, and the less and less I hope that they're there. So it's a new reading, it's a new kind of legibility that you develop if you take that path.
I think in a time now where the art world is kind of flooded with the depictions of the Black body, then yes, it can not only be a form of protest, but also offer viewers a different legibility of the Black experience and its privacy. I thought about this question for a long time, because my current work falls into a long history of Black abstract painters before me who have gone relatively unseen. So is it new? No, it's not new. I think now people, our viewers, I would assume, are wanting the truth, or a newer perceived truth, which is via experience. And, I think he said something great. I think a lot of the work tends to be performative for that reason. I think abstraction is performative. The work that I'm interested in is that always, just whether it's my own work or other work, it's usually performative, even if it's static work. How does it change? How does it activate the space? Can I move with it, around it, and through it? And I think that speaks to the expansiveness of the unseen Black experience, and not the one that is constantly on view, gazed upon, and kind of created without our consent.
I think to feed off of what Chris just said, thank you so much. I see it as we are all performing already. This is just a stage in which we are hopefully showing up as our most authentic selves, but if not, so be it. We're still performing in some sense of the word. And so for the work to be performative as well is kind of inevitable. And showing spaces that I guess are Black perspectives that are unseen, I feel like we can only show, I take that back. I am currently showing only my perspective. And so, and it is because, it is a space that's unseen, because it's me still as an emerging artist inserting myself into the space, right? And so to perform it, I think it's kind of inevitable. I'm gonna leave it there because it is what it is. And I think this is a place where words don't go, because it is what it is. I hope that makes sense. If not, it's okay.
I just want to sit with this, a place where words don't go, because that just gave me chills. So thank you for that. That's, yeah. So Sana or Oasa, do you want to, some last sentiments, little bits? No.
I'm still thinking about this question, a very, very good question, but it's something I need more time to think of. When you say void of the gaze or direct eye contact, rich interior spaces, I see my work as looking out at instead of being looked in.
Mm.
Yeah, I think I have to think about it more, but that's how I think about that particular tree that's in the show right now. It's looking out at that tree was made 30 years ago, and this is only the second time that it's been shown. Hasn't been shown in 25 years, and Ivy came looking for that tree, and when I took it out of the crate and took it there and looked at it, there were images and areas of it that I had never seen before. Yet I'd spent several months making that piece, but in many areas of the piece, it's looking at us. There are faces all around the pieces, of course, with faces with the archival information, but all the patterning, all the scratching are the piece looking at you. Maybe asking a question, I'm not really sure.
Mm. Mm. Well, thank you all. This has been such a treat. Thank you to everyone who's in the audience who bared witness to this really rich conversation. I had so many more questions that I wish I could have asked, and some of the tangents that I wanted to get to, we didn't, but I'm grateful for this space that I got to share with all of you wonderful artists. And I really want us to lean into this, a place where words don't go, because that's also something about the role of the artist, where it's defying these normal forms of communication to get to something that is greater, that is higher, that is more complicated, that is richer and illuminating. So I'm grateful for you all, and have a good evening,
You're
afternoon.
the same.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.